I'm just saying that these traits that we associate with incels are also apparent in the Beast. And as such, I think that Belle's demonstration of strength in that scene could potentially provide a roadmap of how to deal with this issue in the real world. Alright, so a few months ago I made a video about how I believe that many of the female characters of the past who now receive criticism for being weak and or damsels in distress were actually strong, had agency, and demonstrated aspirational qualities that were pivotal to their respective narratives. Now in that video I focused on Arwen from the Lord of the Rings trilogy and Mary Jane Parker from Sam Raimi's original Spider-Man trilogy. But I had initially wanted to include Belle from Disney's 1991 Beauty and the Beast movie. And the reason I wanted to include her was because a few years ago, when Disney was set to release the 2017 live-action remake of the movie, the character of Belle was put under a microscope and essentially suffered the same fate that Arwen and Mary Jane were forced to endure. And the notion arose that Belle was a weak character and a poor role model, which is part of the reason why the 2017 remake sought to quote-unquote fix her character. Additionally, the entire narrative of the original Beauty and the Beast movie was reduced to just being a story about a woman who falls in love with her captor. And thus the claim became that Beauty and the Beast is problematic because it portrays Belle as having Stockholm Syndrome. And for those who are unfamiliar, Stockholm Syndrome is defined as a coping mechanism for a captive in an abusive situation, where the victim will actually develop positive feelings towards their captor or abuser over time. And to be fair, I can see how one might come to this conclusion if they either haven't seen the movie in a while or if they just read the synopsis. But I do believe that once both the context and narrative structure are factored into the equation, it becomes increasingly difficult to stand by this assertion. And in the 6 years since this hot take took the internet by storm, there have been rebuttals to this claim that I think do an excellent job of debunking this entire notion. I recently watched Lindsay Ellis's video on the subject, and I believe she did an exceptional job of identifying specifically what Stockholm Syndrome is, while demonstrating how the narrative in the original Beauty and the Beast movie doesn't lend itself to being defined by this concept at all. She also importantly states that, in a sense, Stockholm Syndrome isn't even real.
But the most important facet that people miss about Stockholm Syndrome is that it is not a diagnosable mental disorder. It is not on the DSM. Stockholm Syndrome is considered a contested illness, as a large portion of the psychiatric and law enforcement community do not think it is a thing.
But despite this thorough debunking, the narrative still persists that Beauty and the Beast is simply a story about a woman who falls in love with her captor, and ultimately teaches young women to accept monstrous behavior from their partners because, who knows, he may turn out to be a prince someday. So for this video, I just wanted to do what I did with Mary Jane and Arwen and make a case for why I believe that Belle is indeed an example of a strong character for both women and men to aspire to, and also address how the diminishing of her character further constricts our conceptualization of what strength is, and in making these arguments, hopefully directly address the assertion that Beauty and the Beast is ultimately a story about a woman who develops Stockholm Syndrome and falls in love with her abuser. So with all that said, let's get into the discussion. So in the beginning, Belle is introduced as an inquisitive, bright, and beautiful young woman who loves to read about adventures and princesses and is seen by the townsfolk as a bit of an outcast. They literally sing about how peculiar she is and how she has her head in the clouds. It's also very evident that she wants so much more than this small provincial French town has to offer. Despite what the townspeople say about her, it is this same peculiarity in her nature that allows her to see right through Gaston, who is basically what would happen if the phrase toxic masculinity became a person. Anyway, the townsfolk all love Gaston, especially this dude, LeFou, which, side note, if you claim that your true concern in this movie is its normalization of Stockholm Syndrome, then how are you overlooking this relationship? For the entirety of this movie, LeFou is constantly being abused by Gaston, in every sense of the word, and yet he remains infatuated with the idea of this man. This is textbook Stockholm Syndrome. They even have him sing an entire musical number dedicated to his greatness. Now, to be honest, I do think it's quite silly to call this out since LeFou is clearly a comedic relief character, and there is obviously no intent from the writers to reinforce the notion that this dynamic is in any way healthy, but I do think that that the disregard for the abusive nature of this relationship highlights a bit of the disingenuity behind the claims that this movie normalizes Stockholm Syndrome, and demonstrates that the objective was never really to earnestly deconstruct the ways in which this movie perpetuated this mental disorder, but instead to create a narrative about the past misrepresentation of female characters using any new available terminology to do it. But anyway, I digress. As I was saying, Gaston's facade doesn't fool Belle for a minute, and I think this is a great example of the strength of her character. I think the psychology of pretty privilege has been pretty well documented. As usual, I can't really say that I agree with how this topic is being discussed in the mainstream, but I don't think that the inefficacy of our discourse discredits the validity of this concept. In any case, I do think that it's fair to conclude that as a society, we downplay, discredit, and overlook some of the more socially unacceptable behaviors of our more physically desirable members. And I think this same mentality is evident in this small provincial French town when it comes to Gaston. And so for a character to not only resist adhering to this psychological norm, but also to resist the societal pressure to give in to this norm is, in my opinion, an incredible display of inner strength, conviction, and resolve. And I believe that this is a trait that we should all aspire to, both women and men alike. Because how prevalent is it in our society to do things because everyone else is doing them, or because everyone else says this is good? And so if we all had a little bit more Belle in us, maybe we wouldn't be so quick to adhere to some of these societal norms. And so for me, at least, from the beginning, the strength of Belle's character was evident and profound. And again, this is a Disney movie, so they're not exactly being subtle about what they're trying to communicate here. And so for us as an audience to essentially be thumped over the head with this obvious messaging and still claim that Belle isn't a strong character, in my opinion, clearly demonstrates how narrow our conceptualization of strength is. But anyway, continuing on, as we all know, Belle eventually ends up in the Beast's castle. But if you were like me and you hadn't seen the movie in a while, you may have forgotten that the reason she was there in the first place was because she was actually looking for her father, who had recently gone missing. The Beast had captured and imprisoned her father in his tower, and so in order to get him out, Belle agrees to trade places with him, effectively sacrificing her entire future and her life so that her father can escape. I feel like I don't need to stress the immensity of this gesture, but I'm going to anyway. Because again, the first few scenes and musical numbers were dedicated entirely to highlighting Belle's dreams, her wants, her desires, and her aspirations. And here we are, not even a quarter of the way into the movie, and she is already being asked to give all of that up. And so for her to forego all of her own personal ambitions so her father can escape a life of imprisonment, despite him reminding her that he was old and had already lived a long and fulfilling life, is no small gesture. This is the same self-sacrifice and disregard for personal desire in service of the greater good that we see in other traditional male heroes. But I assume that since this sacrifice wasn't in service of defeating a bad guy or a supervillain, we just don't place as much emphasis on it. And I think that's part of the problem. Again, Belle has big dreams and an extremely bright future, and so to almost instinctually sacrifice those dreams in order to protect the ones she loves demonstrates a nobility in her character that, again, I think we should all be aspiring to. Now, if you remember the story, you know that despite her obvious distress, Belle didn't take her imprisonment lying down, and she didn't let this dampen her inquisitive nature. She was given one rule: don't go into the West Wing, which we later find out is where the Beast resides. And basically at the first opportunity, that is exactly where she goes, demonstrating the same penchant for trouble that our classic male heroes also embody. Obviously the Beast catches her and just straight up loses his temper, which causes her to run away, which, remember this point for the whole Stockholm Syndrome argument. But anyway, during her flight, she is attacked by wolves and the Beast actually comes and saves her. Deciding not to just leave him out in the snow to die, she brings him back to his castle and tries to patch him up. And this scene is, in my opinion, the crux of the entire story. This is where Belle begins to tame the Beast. They get into a back and forth and Belle straight up puts him in his place. But just as importantly, she also acknowledges his bravery and thanks him for saving her life. Now, the strength on display here is obvious. She is strong for yet again acting selflessly and helping the person who has been nothing but a horror to her, despite not having any guarantees that this behavior will change, all while upholding her oath to remain as his prisoner. Again, she had the choice to go free, but she chose to help him instead. She's also strong for having the courage to stand her ground and not simply accept the derision coming her way from her captor, despite being in a situation where she is at an extreme physical disadvantage. And perhaps most importantly, she is strong for having the strength of character to acknowledge the qualities of an individual who, again, has been nothing but a monster to her since they met. And as for that last point, you can immediately see the effect that that strength has on the Beast. That acknowledgement is what begins to transform transform him. So at this point, I'm gonna go off on a bit of a side tangent here because I wanted to extrapolate from this scene and make an observation as to the larger implications of Belle's strength here. However, I do admit that what I'm about to say may be a bit of a reach. So as usual, it goes without saying that you should always feel free to disagree with anything I say in any of my videos. But especially here, I completely understand if you strongly disagree with my opinion. But anyway, with that said, in my opinion, I believe that the Beast's behavior up until this point bears a resemblance to what we would define as incel behavior. Now, I'll probably make a separate video about this concept and how it's been proliferated since, as usual, I see the current discussion around this issue as doing more harm than good. And I also believe that this word has lost almost all of its original meaning and is basically just used as an insult for any man who says anything negative about a woman once. But if you don't know what an incel is, the word is a portmanteau for involuntary celibate, and was originally used to describe a man who is unable to attract women and will often develop negative views about women due to his lack of success. Now, obviously, I don't believe that the Beast is an incel in this sense, but I do think that he exhibits some behaviors that are characteristic of this labeling. He has a palpable disdain for the world and everybody in it. He blames outside forces for his problems and refuses to look inwards. He expects people to bend to his will as long as he is nice to them, even if that kindness is feigned. And he loses his temper and lashes out at the people around him when things don't go his way. So again, just to be clear, I'm obviously not trying to say that he has become this way because of his lack of success with women, or even that his anger is directed at women in particular. It kind of seems like he's just angry with everybody and everything. I'm just saying that these traits that we associate with incels are also apparent in the Beast. And as such, I think that Belle's demonstration of strength in that scene could potentially provide a roadmap of how to deal with this issue in the real world. Because again, she justifiably stands her ground and calls the Beast out for his abhorrent treatment of her. However, in the same breath, she also acknowledges him and his qualities. And again, we can palpably see the effect that that acknowledgement had. It literally changed him. And I think that if we can apply this thought process to the discussion around incels that we're having in the real world, then we may start to alleviate some of the issues that we only seem to be exacerbating recently. I think that that acknowledgement is the key. And in this case, it wouldn't be about acknowledging the quality of incels, but instead it would be about acknowledging and addressing their reality. Because personally, most of the discussions that I see concerning the incel epidemic are dismissive and belittling, and this comes from both men and women. Essentially, I don't see much acknowledgement or willingness to address the reality that it must be incredibly frustrating, demoralizing, and isolating to continue to fail to attract a partner no matter what you do. It doesn't matter what levers you pull. You can go to the gym and get ripped. You can try to get a better job. You can read all the self-help books that you want. None of that will change the fact that you're not 6 feet tall and making 6 figures, which are qualities that have unfortunately become prerequisites to participating in some of the dating spaces that society is telling you to participate in.
I feel like this is gonna sound bad. I feel like 300,000, I guess if they made less than that, I feel like we wouldn't have the lifestyle I wanted.
I would have to say 127. $500,000. Is that bad?
Probably 150 to $250,000 a year. It's my guess.
150, maybe to 250,000 a year.
Ideally, my husband needs to be making $650,000.
And then over 70% of men never make 100K even once in their lifetime. Over 70%.
Which is so funny because I saw this video the other day where it was saying if your wife can spend more than you make, you need to make more money.
And so it doesn't surprise me at all that these people flock to manosphere influencers who will at the very least acknowledge this reality. Now, it should be obvious that I denounce the entire manosphere ideology as being overtly misogynistic. But again, I don't think that this means that the reasons for people being there are inherently invalid. And I believe that if we keep failing to acknowledge these reasons, then these spaces will only continue to grow. And this is again why I believe that what Belle did in this scene was so powerful. Again, to this point, the Beast has been nothing but a monster to her. And so for her to still be willing to see the good in that person is a monumental demonstration of the strength of her character, which is a strength that, say it with me now, I believe that we should all be aspiring towards, both women and men alike. Anyway, there are many more examples in the movie of Belle demonstrating her strength, but this video is already way too long, so Just to wrap things up, in all of the examples provided so far, there is absolutely no sign whatsoever of Belle succumbing to Stockholm Syndrome. At every point where the Beast was a monster to her, she fought back, eventually going so far as to run away, which is definitively not a characteristic of someone experiencing this mental disorder. After the scene that I defined as the crux of the movie, it isn't Belle who starts to fall in love with the Beast. It is the Beast who starts to fall in love with Belle. In the very next scene that we see them in, the Beast says this.
I've never felt this way about anyone.
And this of course all culminates in the classic dance and dinner scene overlaid with the famous Tale as Old as Time song, where the lyrics explicitly indicate that the Beast is the one that's changing thanks to Belle's influence. And of course all of this leads to the climax where the Beast lets Belle go so that she can go and rescue her father, which of course means that the spell that originally turned him into a beast will last indefinitely. And again, this is definitively uncharacteristic of a person who is experiencing Stockholm Syndrome, seeing as those afflicted tend to push away all external relationships in favor of staying with the object of their infatuation, despite their abuse. And of course at the end she only realizes that she loves him after he had undergone this monumental transformation of character. She didn't fall in love with the abusive Beast. She fell in love with the man that he became, the man who finally understood that love isn't selfish. It doesn't mean binding the object of your affection to yourself and holding on for dear life. In the end, the Beast understood that love means letting go and allowing the person you love to do what is best for them, even if it means sacrificing all of your own desires. And where could he possibly have learned that lesson from?
Take me instead.
You would take his place?
And in that sense, the claim that Beauty and the Beast is actually just a tale about a woman who develops Stockholm Syndrome and falls in love with her captor completely falls apart. But in any case, I think that's going to be it for this one. If you made it this far, thank you so much for indulging me. Again, I know I made a pretty bold claim here, so I completely understand if you wholeheartedly disagree with that aspect of this video. But as to the claim that Belle is a weak character and a poor role model, I do think that the evidence suggests otherwise. Again, you have every right to still disagree with that notion, but personally, I just don't feel like I need to see a sword in her hands to recognize the virtue and nobility that her character represents. But anyway, if you do disagree, or if you just feel like none of this made any sense, please feel free to let me know why so that I can try to address any misconceptions in the comments. But with that said, I wish you all the very best going forward. Take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.